Ideas at Columbia University, where I was a perpetual graduate student. Why law and legitimacy? Immanuel Kant, the 18th century Enlightenment philosopher, once said that two things filled him with wonder: the starry heavens above and the moral law within. The sources of these wondrous things were what formed the basis of his critical philosophy. I'd say a third thing fills me with wonder, and that is the phenomena of government. How is it that perfect strangers acquire the right and therefore the power to compel me to do things against my will? What am I referring about? Things as mundane as the speed limit or a stop sign in a rural location, and as profound as sending me or my children to war, a war we didn't necessarily choose, a war in which we might lose our lives. Similarly, taxation. If taxation is theft, how is it that a certain percentage of my income is stolen from me each year and distributed to strangers for purposes I may not appreciate? Government, I maintain, is a mystery every bit as profound as the starry heavens above and the moral law within.
Morning, Norm.
Hey, good morning. So that was it. That was the maiden broadcast of the Law and Legitimacy podcast a little bit more than 2 years ago, back before Mike and I even met, when I was sitting there in front of this machine trying to make it all work. And now we've become this. And what have we become? I don't know. That's up to you folks. So if you've been following the news, you know I'll be leaving Gilligan's Island today. We got a verdict yesterday in the Proud Boys trial, and it was a shocking verdict, at least to me, perhaps not to the jury. They voted unanimously to convict 4 of the 5 Proud Boys of seditious conspiracy. A 5th, Dominic Pizzola, was not convicted of seditious conspiracy, but was convicted of other counts of conspiracy and of robbery for his taking of a law officer's shield and using it to destroy a window at the Capitol. So in all, each of the Proud Boys were convicted of 6 counts, 6 of the 9 counts they faced. Pizzola was convicted of 7 of the 10 that he faced. So it was a very hard day, personally devastating for me, because all trial lawyers are in it to win it, even in a difficult case. And I didn't think this was a difficult case in terms of the law. It struck me as obvious that these men had engaged in protected speech and had engaged in no conspiracy to oppose by force the authority of the United States government. And let's be clear, that was the charge, that the Proud Boys agreed. They reached an agreement, a meeting of the minds. They came to a common understanding, whatever the locution, to use force to oppose the authority of the United States government. When, you might ask, did they reach that conspiracy? There was never any evidence that they did. The government claimed that their spontaneous conduct, that their conduct on the Capitol grounds on January 6th demonstrated the conspiracy, and that they weren't obliged to prove when it was formed.
That is, can you just repeat that, please?
The government's theory of the case in the Proud Boys case, in the case of United States of America versus the leaders of the Proud Boys, including Joe Biggs, is that they engaged in a conspiracy. That is, they reached a common understanding to oppose by force the authority of the United States government. One of the reasons the trial took so long is we fought savagely every day, every way, to pin the start date of that conspiracy and some discernible date on the calendar, and it never happened. There was not an agreement reached on December 19th, when the president sent a tweet out to the world saying, "Be there, be loud, be wild," or whatever he said. There wasn't an agreement when they arrived on January 4th, that there wasn't one on the 5th. Apparently, and the government argued that their spontaneous conduct on January 6th, when the Capitol was stormed, proved the existence of a common understanding, that their common understanding coalesced into a common plan at that moment. And it was a sort of shocking turn of events. And I tried to argue to the jury that this was a terrifying application of the law and was prevented in large part by objections from the government in making my argument, because I had to stick to the facts and the law in this case. And I tried to warn the jury about what was at stake if there was a conviction in this case for the future, because here's what we have. We had a country in 2020 deeply divided, And perhaps those divisions are as deep or deeper now. We had a sitting president of the United States, who garnered 70 plus million votes. And the night the election results came in, it showed him a winner. Within days, absentee ballots were counted and showed him a loser. And he refused to accept those results and challenged the legitimacy of the proceedings. And his followers around him encouraged this, and he encouraged others to believe that the election was stolen. Think about this in terms of the historic moment we were in. The commander-in-chief, the chief executive, the primary elected officer of the United States told the American people the government was stolen. He urged them to come to the Capitol on January 6th, where the electoral votes were to be certified, to voice their opposition to certification of the election. He gave a speech on the mall, the National Mall, a mile or so from the Capitol, where the votes were to be counted, where he said, we've got to go. I'm going to go up Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol. We've got to fight. We've got to fight like hell, or we won't have a country anymore. People responded to that call. They marched to the Capitol, and they were agitated. And they were agitated because they believed their president. They believed that the election had been stolen. There was a riot. People snapped. Well, eyewitnesses who were there and had been involved in other civil disturbances said it was similar to what they'd seen before. A hothead got going and people followed. And the result was a riot, and not a very destructive riot. The documents that we've seen put the total value of property destruction at the Capitol that day, and this includes fences, windows, doors, at $1.4 million. Far less than the cost of replacing any one building burned in a mostly peaceful protest in the summer of 2020. And I'll say more about that in a moment. The evidence in the we challenged the government to produce a plan, a common understanding, an objective. And the only thing that the government could say is these men had reached an agreement to oppose by any means necessary, including force, the certification of the election. And the language that they used for that proof was the text. We're on our way to a civil war. We got to stop the steal. And these men communicated with one another by way of parlor, by way of telegram, and they took videos of themselves. And the government showed hundreds of videos, hundreds of text messages of men engaged in this speech in angry speech. In speech in which they shared their view that the country was being stolen. We were on the cusp of the Civil War. We needed to fight to take the country back. And they expressed patriotic vigor. And they engaged in what the author Edmund Wilson might call patriotic gore. Among the things they did to fire one another up is they quoted Thomas Jefferson. A government that when the people fear their government, it is tyranny. When government fears the people, it is liberty. Thomas Jefferson's words, as reprinted in their social media accounts, were used as evidence against them of a conspiratorial effort. And so, what is so disturbing to me about this verdict, in spite of Merrick the Chipmunk Garland out there bleeding yesterday at 4:15 that our democracy was at stake and the Justice Department will do anything possible to save it. I beg to differ. Our way of life might be at stake because we're tearing at the cords that bind us. But Merrick Garland and company made a decision. They made a decision to prosecute these men who appeared at the Capitol under cloak of their First Amendment right to petition for redress of grievances, whether right or wrong those grievances. And again, we argued that you couldn't argue that these men had a corrupt intent if they believed their president, because there was a charge that had an element of corrupt intent in it. They chose to believe their president. They went, they gathered, they were angry, the crowd snapped and they broke. We never argued that they were justified in what they did. But what the jury didn't know is that the government had choices. It could have charged these men with misdemeanor trespass, and we would have pled guilty. It could have charged these people with creating a public disturbance, and we would have pled guilty. But when they charged these men with a crime one step removed from treason, we obviously fought and will continue to fight. Because if it's treason to believe our country's founding ideals, if it's treason to appear at the Capitol, if it's treason to scream, stop, stop, stop a steal, If it's a treason to gather in a crowd and oppose the authority of the United States government by demonstration, then we're lost. Now, the prosecution will say, oh, no, all of that was protected. That line was honored. But when the line was crossed and violence occurred, then people had to be held accountable. But in this case, what they're being held accountable for is their speech, for their agreement to oppose by force the government. And there was no such agreement. And I will go to my grave, hopefully no time soon, but I will go to my grave believing that in this case, there was a serious miscarriage of justice and real damage was done to the republic. And
so go ahead. Sorry.
Let me give you, an example that many people have talked about in this case. And, now the gloves are off. I'm free to be able to talk about the case and it feels good. But let me give you, many people who followed this case have said, well, wait a minute. How come nobody got charged in the mostly peaceful protest where billions of dollars of property was damaged and destroyed, where dozens of people were killed or injured throughout the United States in 2020? And there is a difference between those riots and what happened at the Capitol. At the Capitol, there was a national ceremony taking place, the counting of electoral ballots, and the disruption of that was a serious event. But it wasn't a threat to democracy. It was a delay in vote counts while people accounted for the riot and brought the riot under control. I would say it was far more disruptive to our way of life to create a climate of fear and to destroy the businesses that people built forever by means of violence and arson. And not one person, and I'm aware of, and if there is one, somebody let me know. Not one Black Lives Matter protester has been arrested for conspiring to cross interstate lines and engage in arson, which is a federal offense. Every person who stood at a protest line and said no justice, no peace, is as guilty of conspiring to commit arson as the Proud Boys were. If the Proud Boys were guilty of seditious conspiracy, then where are the prosecutions for others to cross interstate line to engage in arson? And I don't want to hear that counting votes is different than opening and managing a business, because in the end, the vote count was delayed for several hours while the building was cleared. Some of our cities still haven't been rebuilt. And what's more, if you look at what's going on in Portland, Oregon, where Antifa, and people say Antifa doesn't exist, get your head out of the clouds and open your eyes to the world around you. The Proud Boys gathered. Many people joined the Proud Boys in the summer of 2020 because they were radicalized. They were radicalized by seeing people on television assaulted for supporting Donald Trump, and they agreed to come and stand between those people being assaulted and the assaultors. And they gathered and they engaged in violent responses to violence. And did they celebrate violence? They had a saying, and I hope they still do: fuck around and find out. If you attack me, I'll fight back, and you'll be sorry you picked the fight. That used to be Americanism, and now it's not. Now the Justice Department has created a climate of fear, where if you're on the right, you have to wonder whether your words will be used against you if something goes wrong somewhere. And I am not overreacting. Consider what we learned in recent months. A Justice Department memo about whether we should study conservative Catholic congregations because they're extremists. We're going to monitor by way of confidential human sources and otherwise parents who attend school boards to protest what their children are being taught, things they probably didn't know about before the pandemic, but now they're upset about it. One of the things we learned in the Proud Boys trial, and I'm calling on Jim Jordan, and I'm calling on the House committee engaged in oversight of a weaponization of the government, to demand a copy of the complete trial transcript in the Proud Boys trial.
This is what I was hoping you were going to get to, because this is you did an interview yesterday with Kevin Allen shortly after the verdict was announced, and one thing that you brought up was the significant presence of confidential informants within the political rights movements, right?
Well, here's what we learned in this trial, and I have to be careful what I say because many of these proceedings are still under seal, but I think this much is clear. During the Proud Boys trial, there were occasions when the court would close the courtroom. He would throw out the public. He would turn off the feed to the media room, and we would and he would order the transcript sealed. And those discussions often involved confidential human sources. And we were trying to find out just how deeply the federal government had penetrated the Proud Boys on the theory that if they were deep within the Proud Boys and they had agents in the Proud Boys, and those agents didn't report a plan, that's evidence that there was no plan. And so one of the things we learned, there were 6 supervising agents, the FBI agents. The file was so massive. Not one of them could answer how many. The government acknowledged finally, after much fighting, there were confidential human sources in the Proud Boys, but not one of the 6 agents was prepared to take the stand and testify how many there were or what database was used to keep track of them. And we learned in discussions with the government that's because none of them were told. They didn't have access to that information. The FBI has a separate unit that has some sort of infrastructure and standards and presumably a head. And this person gets to control who gets access to CHSs and who doesn't. So we said, fine, bring them to trial. And they were prepared to fight us on it. In the end, we reached a stipulation with the government to avoid fighting this, because even the government had to acknowledge we were entitled to some of this information. And what we learned and what we entered into as a stipulation is that there were 8 or more confidential human sources providing information to the FBI about the Proud Boys from the election, the date of the election, until January 6th. And so that permitted us to argue that if they didn't see anything, that's because there was nothing to report. But we don't know what 8 or more means. Was that 20? Was it 30?
200?
Were there other agents involved? And one of the things, and so, I made a tactical choice that I could get that stipulation. I didn't trust that the judge would grant us access to this information. Many of the rulings broke against us in ways that were disturbing. So I took the stipulation, but left on the table an urgent matter of public policy. And, Jim Jordan and members of the House committee, you need to pay attention to the sealed proceedings in this case. And you need to hold the FBI accountable, because I am persuaded that we are at a critical juncture in the country, as critical as it was in the 1970s when we learned that the FBI had infiltrated left-wing groups and was engaging in subterfuge with Martin Luther King. We've got the FBI doing the same thing on the right now. And the FBI doesn't want to talk about it. It doesn't want its sources and methods disclosed to the American people, for fear that if those are disclosed, they won't be able to surveil us quite as effectively. Well, maybe they ought not to be. And maybe when the people fear the government, there is something close to tyranny. And maybe the government does need to fear the people, because they are accountable to us and they are our creation. So, I mean, lots more to say about the trial.
Let's take a couple of questions.
Epic rants and monologue here. I'll shut up for a minute and take.
Well, no, this is something that we'll come back to, but certainly you are more than entitled to some long form rants after 4 months of a grinding trial, and then especially in the wake of that result. Let's see, Thinking Man was one of the first questions I wanted to get to here. Thinking Man asks, is it true that the Proud Boys as an organization has grown substantially since January 6th? How many Proud Boys are there in number? Nixon said that if the president says it, then it's not illegal.
That's a great question, Thinking Man. I don't know is the answer to that. As the court was quick to inform the jury and the government acknowledged, the Proud Boys aren't on trial here. Just its then leadership was, and it's an organization that has a decentralized structure, and there are local chapters, and then there is a national leadership structure. I think the group was largely decimated as a result of these prosecutions, and I don't know what's going on the street. I do know that it's a group that I became far more sympathetic to rather than antithetical to during the course of this trial, because what I learned is it's not a hate group, and it's not a group of extremists. It's a group of people who are afraid about what's happening to this country, and who have found one another and have decided to appear in public on behalf of their ideals and views when they view those ideals under attack. And I fully support that and urge others to do so.
Yeah, and I mean, one need only spend 2 minutes on the phone with Joe Biggs through solitary at Alexandria to come to that same conclusion, Norm. Right? Yeah. I'll leave that some of the stuff about that to you, but I have certainly watched your arc in this matter and have been moved by what you just said, which is that you have been, I guess, pushed to a position where you're skepticism.
I've been radicalized by this
Well, I mean,
experience.
mistrust for the federal government has been recatalyzed, right?
So, I mean, I'm looking at Thinking Man's comments on Rumble, and he says, "Well, that's what every Trump voter says." Normal, well, maybe, but just then maybe that's why they're voting for Trump rather than having been.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. And then Thinking Man goes on to say the reason is income inequality. There's too many broke, disenfranchised people. That's true, and the pie has shrunk.
And that's with respect to the comparison of the various riots, the Antifa stuff in Oregon versus the efforts being made against the now over 1,000 defendants in J6 prosecutions, which that's another thing that you talked about on the Kevin Allen show, but it's also something that we've talked about as well. There were hundreds of prosecutions as an initial phase of this stuff. And then there was more appropriations made for another 1,000 or more planned prosecutions pursuant to J6.
Well, and that's right. But I mean, I just want to return. I'm not sure I'm understanding Thinking Man's points well enough. I mean, Thinking Man, when you say, the reason is income inequality, there's too many broke, disenfranchised people. That's right. That's what the protests on January 6th was about a sense of disenfranchisement. And people came out to protest that the city riots. Yeah, I mean, there is discontent in the country, but I don't think you get to choose to penalize one group of discontent and ignore the others and claim that, well, the others are in some sense justified, or this was civil disobedience gone awry. I mean, from the perspective of many in the United States, there was no accountability for what took place in the summer of 2020. And to hold the Proud Boys accountable for a riot on January 6th of 2021 is a little rich.
And then just imagine now, because, President Biden announces his candidacy for 2024, and he does it on the back of that jingoistic gore motif that you referenced earlier about, sort of the Proud Boys and how they describe things. But he's now going to lean into this. Right.
Well, he will, and I suspect, in this next wave of prosecutions, I fully expect Donald Trump to be prosecuted. And let me say more about that.
It's me again, Sai's question. It's me again, Sai says, do these convictions make it easier to charge and prosecute Trump for J6?
I think it does. I think, this was, again, it was a bitterly fought case, hand-to-hand combat for months. And we challenged everything that we could. And in spite of that effort on behalf of 8 defense lawyers, the government was able to get a conviction on almost all of the top counts. I think of the 49 counts or so, they got 30 convictions, and almost all the top counts were convictions. And those are the ones that people will remember. And I get that. But what they learned is that, you could make a conspiracy case stick against a person who merely spoke and merely appeared at a location. And the testing of the notion of corrupt purpose in one of the counts is being litigated in the appellate courts right now. In fact, I'll be attempting to go to the United States Supreme Court on one of these cases in mid-June. We're going to be filing a petition. But I mean, if it's a crime to believe the president, then was it a crime for the president to say what he said and to try to inspire a crowd? If the Proud Boys, and here's another theory that was advanced in the trial that shocked us as lawyers, and the appellate court will have a lot to say about it. Normally, if a number of people conspire together to break the law, they are all guilty. The co-conspirators are all guilty. In this case, prosecutors said they had tools. They had people who weren't part of the conspiracy, but who they influenced and used. And so the actions and words of those tools were admitted in spite of barriers and bars against hearsay and foundation to show the conspiratorial efforts of the Proud Boys. So members of the crowd they never met or knew were held to be their tools in their conspiracy. If you apply that logic to Donald Trump on the ellipse, every single person on the mall was a tool. And did he work with people on his staff to overturn the election results or to stop the steal? Yes, there's conspiracy. Did he use tools known and unknown to him? Of course he did. All they could play on in his criminal trial as the primary exhibit, his speech on the ellipse, and open and rest with that. And so I think that the prosecution of Trump's is highly likely. And then he would have to offer a test in his defense, good faith, no conspiracy, that he was acting within his rights as the chief executive and highest elected officer in the land to explore every legal avenue, including protest and mobilization of protesters, to stop the steal of an election and engage in a recount with alternative electoral pools. Now, do I believe the Justice Department will do it? I think it would be an amazing thing to do, especially on the cusp of a presidential election when the Justice Department has traditionally not brought charges that could affect an election. But man, Biden has weaponized January 6th. And I got a hunch. I got a hunch that they're going to do it. Now, Justin Carter says free speech doesn't apply to Trump. Justin, free speech doesn't apply to anyone anymore. Because if you engage in violent speech, if you engage in emotional speech, and then you appear at an event that looks like it's related to that speech, you could be accused of organizing the event. There was no mechanism by which the Proud Boys mobilized this crowd. There just wasn't. And so, sour grapes, I lost the case. I'm a competitive trial lawyer. It was a big stage and I didn't succeed. So yes, there's some bitterness there, but I think that there is reason for concern for every American right now who cares about the Republic and who dares to speak out.
Well, that's why I asked you to say what you said again earlier in the stream, right? What you just, the answer you just gave to Justin is effectively that, right? We're talking about freedom of speech and we're talking about freedom of association. And in the context of a charge of seditious conspiracy, the government is obligated to make certain showings. And the result of this verdict pivots on a central theme that the government pushed forward here, which I think, Norm, you would fairly categorize this as precedent setting argumentation from the DOJ, right?
The tools theory was shocking. We were stunned by it. And stunned that they were able to get the judge to go along. Now, the judge was Timothy J. Kelly. I'm not going to attack him, but it does bear noting that he was a member of the Justice Department's Public Integrity Unit before he became a judge, and so he was aware of what the Justice Department did with respect to prosecuting public officials and so forth. And we had this sense from time to time at trial that he hadn't forgotten his roots. And that his rulings seem to be tilted in the direction of the government. We will obviously take that up on appeal.
I love how simple Rachel's comment there is. It's profiling.
Yeah, it's profiling the right. And, I think that you can't help but wonder in the case of the disparate treatment of the summer 2020 people, whether Black lives, well, I guess they matter because they get to burn stuff up and loot stores. And that's justice. That's because this is the call of the oppressed for change. When the people whose stores got looted or friends were beaten in the city, as we stood by and watched these mostly peaceful protests, went to Washington to claim, wait a minute, my country isn't what I thought it was. This election has been stolen. There's something wrong here. These people get locked up and thrown away, and the arsonists get set free. It just doesn't, or the arsonists don't get set free. They don't even get charged. They get a hall pass, and such is the world we live in here.
Lawyer Will says the Public Integrity Unit uses a lot of undercover and confidential informants. It's one of the only ways to bust public officials.
Well, it may be, and that's why. But in the Justice Department also maintains a separate unit for domestic surveillance because it claims to have a regard for the First Amendment and doesn't want these groups engaging in conduct that will chill people in the expression of their protected speech.
Well, this came to a mini head, right? When it was like the big Excel spreadsheet with the missing cells that was unlocked, right?
Right.
And then there were how many motions for a mistrial that were filed after that. But yeah, that just to give sort of a historical point for people to reference when we're talking about this, the presence of CHS and the DOJ's unwillingness to go sort of beyond the that curtain that has been drawn over it with respect to knowing
that it drew over itself. Right.
And but that's sort of meta, right? Because it draws it over itself, except there's already a hierarchy. There's a tiered hierarchy there, right? There are firewalls that are embedded within firewalls, and so the judge in this case was tasked with ruling on, I guess, potential for whatever sort of amorphous harm could befall however many agents are out there, right? Because we don't know.
Well, they're not agents. That's the difference. A confidential human source is different.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yes. So yeah, just CHS.
Well, I get, that's a fight to come, as is the appeal. As lawyer Will says, the seditious conspiracy appeal will be interesting. I'm hoping to take it, to take that appeal. If you look at if you look on Google at the history of the seditious conspiracy charges in this country, the act itself that these guys were prosecuted with was created in the Civil War era to go after individuals who continued to oppose the authority of the United States after the Civil War. It's almost never been used against Americans, and these convictions stand as precedent setting. What I find so ironic in this case is in the Civil War, which cost us 600,000 American lives, almost all the rebels had been repatriated within 2 years of the war. And the country made an active effort to unite together, to come together, to rebuild after bloodshed. More than 2 years after a riot at Capitol Hill, the Justice Department is promising still more prosecutions. And the acts that it's engaging in are deeply divisive and causing damage to the Republic. And so I stand with Jim Jordan and his oversight committee. I hope they don't back down, and I hope they ask the right questions.
Well, and I also hope that they can actually do something in response to anything uncovered that confirms any one or more of the elements that we're talking about here today. I'm cynical with respect to congressional committees and their ability to actually solve problems rather than just pointing a flashlight on something and giving people a momentary sigh of relief over, oh, finally, yep, see, they did it, right? They at least pointed it out. Nothing is changing. Nothing has changed.
Well, we get the government we deserve, and maybe we don't want more. And maybe, people say that, January 6th, the riot was an attack on democracy. Maybe we don't. Maybe we're not Democrats. Maybe we don't want it. Maybe we're content to be ruled in an authoritarian fashion, so long as we're kept happy, fat, and sassy. That's always been the trade-off: liberty versus security.
It's true. It's true.
All right. Well,
another day. I think we're gonna. Well, what's your plan? You going back home? What's going on?
Well, I hope to. Yeah, I was going to pack up and leave last night, but one of my good buddies, Stephen Metcalf, who got the acquittal for Pizzola and seditious conspiracy, I promised him I'd stick around. So we went and sat at a bar last night. I was drowning my sorrows. He was high-fiving himself for having kicked the government's ass on that count. And now I'm up, and I'm going to pack and hope to be on the road by about noon and home this evening. So I'm looking forward to it.
That's awesome. I know you are. Well, we will reconvene on Monday, give you time to get back up to the great wild yonder that is Connecticut, and maybe you'll make it up to your Northeast Kingdom.
I don't know about that. I've got unfortunately, the Alex Jones appeal in the Sandy Hook case is due at the end of the month. So I've been scratching away at that brief while the jury's out. I got to get some serious working done. And a trial lawyer's life is bad, because I've been called to trial yet again on May 15th in another case, and I'm trying to get a couple weeks to rest. But the court's like, forget about it. We own your ass, and we're the lawnmower, you're the grass. We're gonna mow you down, and maybe they will. As to 8 a.m., are we going back to 8 a.m.? Justin asks.
I think we should. Right.
All right. 8 a.m. on Monday. 8 a.m. it is, folks. See you then.
8 a.m. And if you are still watching, which there's many of you that are, please give this a thumbs up. Please subscribe, share all of this with your friends and family. And please also consider becoming a member on Locals as we get Norm back into the throes of his normal trial lawyer life and out of the swamp-laden streets of D.C. We hope to begin bringing on some guests again for long-form interviews. I know Ron Coleman expressed a willingness to come on here, actually a desire to come on here and talk with us one morning. So we'll have him join in the near future, talk a lot about this. I'd love to get his take on the First Amendment's role within all of this, just because Ron is a First Amendment scholar.
And I'd like to bring Steve Metcalf in. He's a young lawyer I met.
I would be honored to host that conversation. So we'll do that. Everybody have a great weekend. If you're celebrating Cinco de Mayo, do so responsibly, please. We're not in a world where where you're going to get sort of the away with what you used to.
And call your local Proud Boys chapter. Tell them Garrick Marlin sent you, or Merrick Garland, whatever his name is. Tell
Garrick
him
Marlin.
I'm tired. Tell him Merrick Garland. Tell him Merrick sent you.
Yeah,
All right?
someone's going to change their name to Derek Marlin in the chat. Somebody please do that for posterity. All right, Norm. See you later. Have a good weekend. Thank you, everybody. Thumbs up on the video. We'll see you on Monday.